Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, my prediction for the Timberwolves second half. Also, a prediction from Bleacher Report, perhaps a little surprising where they think the Wolves might end up. Also, the Timberwolves' potential worst and best playoff matchups. Which team do the Wolves match up the best against, and which ones would they potentially struggle with the most in a possible play-in or playoff first-round matchup? It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Happy Thursday, everybody. Happy only one day until the Timberwolves next, I don't know, post-All-Star break. It's not really the second half. The post-All-Star break schedule kicks off for the Wolves. They haven't played now in a full week, so it's about time that basketball gets going again. A big thank you, first of all, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, the show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7 for free. That's not just this show, all the other Locked On Minnesota podcasts. Just download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today. Again, that's either Roku or Amazon Fire TV. You can also, of course, follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves, and also at my account, which is at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. All right, so today on the show, I want to look at Bleacher Report had an article with just some second half of the season predictions. And this was put out by Grant Hughes over at Bleacher Report. He went through the odds, actually our friends over at FanDuel as well, title odds for each team, where he's projecting each team to finish in terms of playoff seeding, play-ins, and then he went on to predict each matchup in the playoffs and who might win. So a pretty ambitious projection project, and that got me thinking. We'll get to what he said about the Wolves here in a minute. Got me thinking about potential matchups, because he had the Wolves actually getting out of the play-in and being the sixth seed in the West, but the matchup he had them, and the team that he had them matching up with in the first round is an awful matchup for Minnesota. So it got me thinking, like, hey, what are the best and worst matchups for the Timberwolves? And it's not just straight, like, what teams did they play the best in the regular season? Like, who did they win against in the regular season? Because here's the thing, the more I went through it, there's so many instances of teams resting guys, of guys legit being hurt, that you go down the list in the Western Conference, and every game it's like, oh, the Wolves won this game, but the opponent was missing so-and-so. Or the Wolves, lost this game, but they were missing Towns and Gobert, or what have you. So it's really tough to just take those regular season matchups at face value. Not to mention, of course, the regular season is a completely different animal, but it does play into it, right? It factors in. And of course, the track record in the regular season, what teams are good at and what they're not so good at. That's where we get that data, right? And we can certainly anticipate that certain things about each matchup will change in the playoffs, but it's hard to know for sure until it actually happens, right? So I want to talk about some matchups. I want to talk about the Bleacher Report thing. First, I'll give my prediction, what I think the Wolves will do the rest of the way record-wise. They've only got 21 games left on the schedule, which is insane. And like, you look around in the Western Conference, and the Wolves have played so many more games. Like, for instance, the Wolves are only one game behind the Sacramento Kings in the win column. The Kings are in third in the West, but the Timberwolves have played 4 more games than the Kings. So the Kings have won 1 more and lost 5 less than the Timberwolves have. It's just crazy. So all that to say, I think the Timberwolves over their final 21 games will go 13-8. The reporting most recently from Shams Charania at the Athletic and Stadium says that Karl-Anthony Towns, the Wolves are hoping for him to be back in the final 10 to 15 games of the season. Well, the final 15 games is like basically a week from now, right? It's like, I don't know, 10 days from now. So I guess that'd be on the optimistic side, right? But I think they'll go 13-8 over the rest of the season. I did look at the schedule. There's some more back-to-backs. There's a lot more road games. It's road heavy for the Wolves. But there's a handful of games, like coming out of the break, they get Charlotte. And then you go on this kind of not quite murderer's row, but a tough West Coast road swing, right? The Warriors, of course, are behind the Wolves right now. The Clippers, the Lakers, who are out of the playoff race, the Kings, who are third, all on the road. Then you come home for a couple of tough, I think still tough home games, Philadelphia and Brooklyn. At Atlanta is winnable, at home for Boston, and then a reasonable road trip, Chicago, Toronto, New York, all potentially winnable games. Home for Atlanta again, so you get the Hawks twice, which is nice. Of course, they just fired their head coach here in the last couple days. And then the end of the season is really hard. At Golden State, at Sacramento, at Phoenix, home for the Lakers, home for Portland, both of whom will be fighting likely for playoff positioning or the right to be in at least the play-in. At Brooklyn and at San Antonio could be a little easier at that point, and then they close at home against the Pelicans, who without Zion Williamson at the moment could be scratching and clawing for playoff positioning. So it's a really tough second half schedule. But I think there's enough soft games in there. Atlanta twice, the Spurs at the end of the season. Maybe your face. Like, I think the Wolves do manage to go 13-8. And if they do that, of course, that means they'll finish with a record of 44-38 for the season, which is 2 games worse than last year. I think, and this is really hard to know, but in this year's Western Conference, I mean, last year that would have been like, the 8th best record. I think the Wolves were 7th in the West last year. It would have been the 8th or 9th record last season. This year, 44 wins. It probably gets you the 7th seed. It could get you the 6th seed, conceivably. I think the Wolves will be kind of right on the cusp of that 6-7 spot. They're currently in 8th. They're in a virtual tie with the Pelicans for 7th, and a half game ahead of the Warriors for 9th. But they're also only a game behind Dallas in 6th and Phoenix. They're 2 games behind Phoenix in 5th. 2 games, a game and a half behind Phoenix in 5th place. So, I mean, you could make the argument the Wolves finish anywhere from, you could argue 3rd to 12th, right? 3rd to out of the play-in. That's how close the Western Conference is. In fact, the play-in to the 3rd spot to the 12th spot is only a 4.5 game difference right now. Now that's significant ground over 21 games, but for that big of a, from 3rd to 12th, that's crazy. So I think it gets them maybe to 6th, more likely to 7th in the West. You look at the teams ahead of them: Denver, Memphis, Sacramento, the Clippers, Suns, Mavs, and Pelicans. The Pelicans and Mavs are the 2 most obvious to fall behind the Wolves. I mean, the Suns should only get better. The Clippers aren't going to get worse. I think the Kings are clearly good, right? I mean, obviously. And the Grizzlies and Nuggets aren't going anywhere. So I think the Wolves could pass Dallas. I think they could pass the Pelicans depending on Zion, and they could get to the 6th, maybe to 7th. Behind the Wolves, you obviously worry about the Warriors, less so the Lakers. I mean, the Lakers are 3 behind the Wolves right now. The Warriors would be the main threat to pass the Wolves. But if they can hold off, like say the Wolves pass the Pelicans and Mavs, but the Warriors pass the Wolves, that puts Minnesota in 7th in the West. I think that's a pretty reasonable, at this stage, a reasonable outcome. Now, before the season, if you had said, oh yeah, the Wolves will win 44 games to go to the play-in, I'd say that's a disaster of a season. I think we all would have, right? Coming to the season, after winning 46 games last year, trading for an All-NBA, multi-time All-Star, multi-time Defensive Player of the Year in Rudy Gobert, you 100% would expect Gobert plus an ant leap to get this team. I mean, I said before the season, I'm accountable to this. I said the 49.5 over-under line was insane. The win total line was insane. I thought the Wolves would be an easy over. And, of course, Karl-Anthony Towns' injury has something to do with the fact that they're almost certainly going to be under that. But, if it's not a topic for now. There's a lot of other things that have gone into that, right? So all that to say, I think the Wolves go 13-8. I think they win 44 games. They probably finish 7th. I'd say that that's the most likely spot with a chance they're in 6th or 8th. But I don't know that they could really conceivably at all. I mean, it's mathematically possible, but I'd be shocked if they finished higher than 6th in the West. And I don't think, knock on wood, I hesitate to even say this, I don't think they fall out of the play-in. Regardless, there's not a whole lot of margin for error here, right? I mean, again, 3rd to 12th or even 3rd to 11th out of the playoffs is a what? 4.5 game span. It's absolutely insane. So it'll be fascinating to watch. I do want to get into some of these matchups, given where the Wolves are, and of course at this stage you could probably name 7 or 8 teams that the Wolves could conceivably face in the first round of the playoffs. I'm going to pick. What did I pick? I think I picked 6. 3 matchups, or actually 2 matchups I'm okay with, and 3 matchups I worry about for the Wolves. So I want to do that here next because it's time to start really kind of thinking about that as we draw, believe it or not, within we're less than 2 months out from the start of the playoffs. So let's get into that conversation here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at FanDuel. The midway point, the unofficial midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and threes drained. So one of my favorite things about it is there's so many different things you can bet on. I had fun with it All-Star weekend, All-Star Saturday night. Of course, I mean, Wolves Hornets on Friday. There's plenty you could look at for that game. So be sure to check it out. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. Don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, it's time to talk playoff matchups. And I think this is a pretty fascinating conversation. And I mentioned off the top of the show, I don't think we can straight look at like, oh, well, the Wolves beat this team 2 out of 3 times. Like, it's not quite that simple. There's so many other factors in the regular season, injuries being the biggest one, injury/rest. But I want to do my best to kind of parse which of these matchups are, I don't want to say like I'd be excited about them because in the playoffs it's going to be tough regardless, but matchups that I think could be advantageous for the Wolves. One of those is the LA Clippers. I think that it's easy to say the Clippers are very, very reliant, as many teams are, but extremely reliant on their 2 best players. And while they have a deep roster, I don't think they're quite as comfortable playing small ball against the Wolves in the way that they might be able to do it against other teams. And so far this season, the Timberwolves lost to them in a low scoring game. They scored just 88 points in a mid-December loss to the Clippers, but then they turned around and beat them here in early January by 13. And I mean, that was a game where, I mean, like the Clippers were extremely shorthanded, right? I mean, there was no Paul George, there was no Kawhi Leonard, and the Wolves still, like, this thing wasn't close going to the fourth quarter. It got a little closer than maybe it should have. But like, that's a perfect example of like, we can't read too much into that, right? This was a John Wall off the bench, Norman Powell off the bench game for the Clippers. Guys that aren't with that team anymore are playing quite a bit. Of course, the Clippers have revamped their roster just a little bit. I guess it would be is maybe underselling it a bit, but the loss to them earlier this season, the Wolves got beat 99-88. That was December 14th. And of course, no Karl-Anthony Towns for the Wolves. There was actually no D'Angelo Russell in this game either. And Ant was the only player that scored more than 13 points for the Wolves in that game. But the Clippers matchup, I think the reason why I like it is that the Clippers are so reliant on those big 2. They've also there's a lot of moving pieces with the changes they made to their roster. The Wolves have, for the most part, guarded Kawhi and PG pretty well over the last couple of years, as well as you really can. And the Clippers aren't really great at any one specific area. They're a really good defensive team, which worries me a bit considering the Wolves' offensive inconsistencies. And again, they scored just 88 points against them earlier this season, albeit the Wolves' offense was very shorthanded in that game. But I don't hate the matchup. I think you do a good job to slow down one of Paul George or Kawhi Leonard. You put Jaden McDaniels on one. I mean, you put Jaden on Kawhi, and then you have Ant try and guard Paul George. Foul trouble would obviously be a big deal because, the Wolves have enough size and length to contend with them. But if they get into foul trouble, now you're into Taurean Prince and you're into, Kyle Anderson and guys that you don't necessarily want on an island. I mean, you don't want anyone on an island against Kawhi and PG, but that would be my main concern. It would be the Clippers, how good they are defensively, and getting McDaniels and Edwards, especially into foul trouble. But I that matchup's not horrible. It doesn't really scare me if I'm the Wolves. The other one that I like, and there may be a little recency bias playing in here, but I don't mind this matchup at all, and I'll explain why. That's the Dallas Mavericks. And I know they went to the conference finals last year. They were really outclassed by Golden State and I overachieved in getting there, especially based on, I mean, some of their overachievements in the regular season too, right? Dallas has come back down to earth this year in a big way. We all knew that they weren't as good of a defense as they actually aren't as good defensively as they seemed to be for much of last year. And now they've dealt so much of their perimeter defense. I mean, there's no like who there is stopping Anthony Edwards, right? And we saw this just a week ago against the Wolves. Um, them trading Dorian Finney-Smith is really significant. It's just a different roster, and Jason Kidd said as much after that game, after the Wolves win in Dallas a couple of weeks ago. Now he was like, "Hey, people want to see offense. We'll outscore the other team." I'm paraphrasing. He actually said it in more simple, almost cruder terms. But like Kyrie and Luka Doncic combined for 69 points against the Wolves, 69 of Dallas's 121 points, and Christian Wood had 24 of them, right? They had three guys with 24 or more points. Nobody else scored more than six. It's a very top-heavy roster with zero perimeter defense. Like Reggie Bullock is like the only guy, at times Josh Green can be an okay defender, but like there just is no true bench depth besides Christian Wood. There's no perimeter defense at all off the bench. It's a very, in my opinion, a very beatable team, which is crazy considering you have two of the best individual offensive players in the last several years on this roster in Luka and Kyrie. I just don't hate, and it's similar to the Clippers thing, right? They're top heavy. They rely on their two best players a lot, and the Wolves have perimeter defenders that can match up with. They're one of the few teams you can put Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards out there and back them up with Taurean Prince and Kyle Anderson. And in this case, because these guys are a little bit smaller than the Kawhi PG tandem in LA, like you could get Austin Rivers involved. It's a winnable matchup for Minnesota because you don't have to focus too much on anybody else. And the lack of perimeter defense means Anthony Edwards can go nuts. And he did that against Dallas a week ago. He had 32 points, had 22 shots, got to the line 7 times, and I thought could have done a lot more. And also, Dallas in that game, the Wolves built a big lead because Rudy Gobert had his way early. He shot 9-9 from the floor, had 21 and 14 in the game, but then Dallas went small. But the Wolves can overcome Dallas's small ball. And obviously that's what they would try the next time these two teams match up is going to small ball earlier. But I think the Wolves could beat Dallas when it comes to small ball. I think that's a winnable matchup for Minnesota because of their superior perimeter defenders, because of, when Karl-Anthony Towns comes back, it's going to be a lot more challenging to go small against the Wolves and not pay for it. Karl-Anthony Towns is a better player than Naz Reid. I mean, put simply. And Kyle Anderson's good. He's not best cast as a small ball 5. He's best cast as a medium to small ball 4, right? So you put Towns at the 5, Anderson at the 4, fine. You played Rudy off the floor. Now you got to deal with an all-NBA center and Karl-Anthony Towns. If you don't play Rudy off the floor, he's going to have 20 and 10 and or 18 and 9 or whatever, and the Wolves will build this big lead like they did in Dallas, a week and a half ago or so. So it's certainly the Wolves can be a pick your poison team when Karl-Anthony Towns returns. And the Dallas matchup to me does not really scare me. I think that they've been a bit overrated since some of the smoke and mirrors of last season's team, in my opinion. That's what I would call it. And I would not hate that matchup if I'm Minnesota. If you're looking at the potential playoff matchups, and right now, the Wolves and Mavs I lost it. I think they're like within a game of one another. Let's see. Yeah, the Wolves are half game behind the Mavs. Mavs are in 6th. The Wolves have played one more game and they lost that one more game. So they're half game behind Dallas. And I don't know, like if the playoffs started today, the Wolves would be playing Golden State in that first play-in game. And then, I mean, we'll talk about Golden State actually here in a minute, but then potentially winning. And, I guess you wouldn't, if the playoffs ended up how the standings are right now, you're not going to face Dallas to the second round. But of course, they're within a half game. So a lot could change. The Wolves could be in 7 and, Dallas could drop to 10, or the Wolves could drop to 10 and Dallas could be 7, or they could both be 8 and 9 at this point. So it's a perfectly reasonable idea that they could match up against each other. All right. There's 3 teams that I worry a bit about the matchups for the Wolves. And I want to close by talking through those briefly, a couple minutes on each team, why I don't like the matchup for the Wolves. And that's how we'll close today's show. All right, a few playoff matchups that scare me a bit for the Wolves. I'll start with the one that Grant Hughes at Bleacher Report talked about kind of at length. So we'll start there. So again, this Bleacher Report article goes into some depth about like really in the weeds on potential playoff matchups. But he's got the Wolves finishing in 6th in the Western Conference, and it's funny because of the 10 team that he's got, seeded 1 through 10 in the West. The Wolves by far have the longest championship odds of any of them. He's got the Wolves at 6 with championship odds, according to FanDuel, plus 24,000 for the Wolves to win the championship. The next closest is the Kings, which is plus 1,300 among the top 10 here. Now in the East, the Wizards are plus 50,000. But other than that, the Wolves have the second longest odds of any playoff team, according to Grant Hughes, which is kind of crazy and I don't know, maybe not surprising, certainly sobering. But Hughes has the Timberwolves finishing at 6th in the West and taking on the Phoenix Suns. The Phoenix Suns are a petrifying matchup for me if I'm Chris Finch. And, Grant Hughes does a really good job of breaking this down. The cliff notes are that the Suns are the league's best and most proficient mid-range shooting team, and the Timberwolves player drop coverage and pick and roll a lot with Rudy Gobert, meaning that, what's open? Well, it's the 10 to 18 footer. Right. I mean, the Wolves played that exclusively a couple years ago, and D'Angelo Russell, when he was at the Warriors, ate them alive. Kyrie Irving, when he was with Brooklyn, did the same thing. And Chris Paul, Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, 3 of the best mid-range jump shooters that this generation has seen. The one game the Wolves won against the Suns, there was no Devin Booker. I don't think Chris Paul played, and certainly Kevin Durant was not there. So how do the Wolves defend against that? I mean, I certainly think they'd have to mix their coverages. They probably mix in some zone, although that's dicey against a team like Phoenix. The Wolves don't do it much anyway. But over the course of a series, I think you'd have to try that. I think they would try switching things a little bit more, but that gets scary too when you've got Durant and Booker taking advantage of anybody besides Jade McDaniels or Anthony Edwards guarding them. They could hunt matchups very easily and pick and roll. We saw the Mavs do that recently. We've seen a lot of teams do that against Gobert, right? That's how he's gotten played off the floor in the past as a member of the Utah Jazz. So I think the Wolves, that would be a really tough matchup because of the mid-range shooting ability of Phoenix and their ability to kind of dictate matchups, really, right? Grant Hughes at Bleacher Report has the prediction of Suns in 5 if they face each other in a 3-6 matchup. I think that's completely reasonable. I think that would be a really kind of a nightmare matchup for the Timberwolves to have to take on the Phoenix Suns in a 7-game series. So I agree there. I really don't like it. Another one, and this is me now that I don't like, is the Golden State Warriors matchup. The Wolves beat the Warriors a couple of weeks ago, but Golden State is one of those teams that can go small if they want to, and the Wolves can't do much about it. You maybe could have Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor when Draymond Green is playing center. I mean, obviously that's happened before, but I mean, like the Warriors play Draymond Green at the 5 and they play Kevon Looney at the 5. And I guess, Kuminga is in the mix there too in the front court, but like, that's kind of it. And those are guys that the Wolves should be able to exploit. They haven't been able to do it with Rudy Gobert to this point against Golden State. Now, Gobert didn't play, by the way, when the Wolves beat the Warriors, and both teams played a lot of small ball. Naz Reid started and had 24 and 13 in that game. This was just a couple of weeks ago. I guess beginning of the month, February 1st. But no Rudy Gobert in that win for the Wolves. It's interesting because it's a matchup that, again, playing small ball, the Wolves can kind of hold their own there. But they're not going to want to play small ball if they've got Rudy Gobert at their disposal, right? So it's a bit of the whole, like, how soon do you pull the goalie, I guess, to borrow and somewhat misuse a hockey term. How early in the game do you say, all right, we're going to play a little small ball? Because Golden State should be better at it than Minnesota. It's just the Wolves have, I think, once you get past Steph Curry, about as much talent, right? Like the bench in Golden State is okay. Got a couple of nice pieces. Kuminga's got a bright future. DiVincenzo's a good player. Kevon Looney's obviously effective. But Minnesota has depth, right? And they've got frontline guys in Ant and in Cat and really good role guys in Taurean Prince and Kyle Anderson, especially. Steph Curry stands out as the biggest difference maker, which is obvious. But I think that small ball is something the Wolves should do okay in against Golden State. I just think they're the masters of it. And so that matchup would really worry me. Of course, also their 3-point shooting ability in any game, but also, of course, over the course of a series would worry me too. Statistically, they shoot the most threes per game. When you adjust for pace, they're third in 3-point attempt rate. They are number one in pace. So Golden State could beat the Wolves at their own game. They don't get to the line a ton, which helps the Wolves because the Wolves do foul a lot. And Golden State does turn it over a lot. So they don't get to the line a lot, but they do turn it over a lot. They counteract that by making a ton of threes. And that's something that would worry me if I'm the Wolves. All right, the last matchup is the Denver Nuggets. Denver doesn't, contrasting them from the Warriors, they don't shoot a ton of threes, but when they shoot them, they make them. And the Wolves tend to leave a lot of 3-point shooters open. We saw this the last time the Wolves took on Denver. Minnesota bust, they allow coverages to be busted far too often. This is the number one offensive rated team in the league. The Denver Nuggets are. They're also number one in 3-point percentage, even though they're only 23rd in 3-point attempt rate, and they played a pretty slow pace. They're first in percentage, 39.2% as a team. They're also a strong rebounding team. They're 13th in offensive rebound percentage and 6th in defensive rebound percentage. Both areas the Wolves have struggled this year. Towns has never gotten the best of the Joker matchup. I mean, Jokic versus Towns, it's been advantage Joker almost every time. I also think the Nuggets rival the Wolves' wing depth. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Aaron Gordon, Bruce Brown. Like there's just enough guys there on the perimeter, on the wings, to give the Wolves trouble and to really match up with some of the vets that I mentioned a minute ago. The Wolves have that some of these other teams don't, and it could be an area that they might have a slight advantage against a team like Golden State, depth on the wing, right? But you don't have that advantage against the Nuggets. The Nuggets are a well-rounded team. They're obviously well-coached, and that's the sort of team that could spell trouble for the Wolves. A well-rounded, well-coached team that does a couple things really well that the Wolves struggle at. Defending the three-point line has been a bit of an issue the past year plus. Denver's the best in the league at it, and if you miss a defensive coverage, if you miscommunicate, we still see that a ton from these Wolves, Denver's going to make you pay with a made wide open three-pointer or a Jokic bucket or a Jokic assist to a back cut. It's just a tough matchup for anyone, of course. I mean, they're the best team in the Western Conference, so of course they're a tough matchup, but that one would make me uneasy for sure. So recapping, it's the Warriors, it's the Nuggets, it's the Suns that I don't want to see. I'm okay with seeing the Clippers. My ideal matchup at this moment is the Dallas Mavericks, and I get it. I get Kyrie and Luka in a playoff series. I get that that's tough, but it's a winnable matchup for Minnesota, and I'd prefer to have that one than some of these other ones that could potentially come to fruition. All right, that's all I have for you today here on the show. I want to do some final some player predictions on Friday. I also want to preview Wolves Hornets. We haven't seen Charlotte in a while, so that'll pretty much be Friday's show. We'll be right back into it. We'll do the post-game postcast, the live postcast. We haven't done one with Marnie now in over a week and a half. Marnie Gellner and I will go live about 45 minutes following Wolves Hornets right here on Locked On. We'll go live on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel, and then you can listen to the audio after the fact on any of the audio platforms for Locked On Wolves. Again, that's Friday night after Wolves Hornets, about 45 minutes after that game. We'll do the same thing after the Wolves game Sunday too. So we'll be back in the saddle. I think it's every game except the TNT games here moving forward is when you'll get Marnie and I about 45 minutes following live on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. All right, that's all I have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on Locked On Sports Minnesota. That's a free app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Now make your second listen the Game to Game NBA podcast. Every moment, every top performance, and every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA. Available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.